Welcome to the School of Christian Mysticism as we continue our meditation on the Interior Castle by Teresa of Avila. We use the translation by Mirabai Starr. We've reached the fifth dwelling now of the Interior Castle. We have 3 reflections on each dwelling. Interestingly, the sections are getting a bit longer. The 5th dwelling is 5 chapters, and I see the next dwelling is actually 11 chapters. It's almost as though the more deeply we get into the spiritual path and we move really beyond words, the more words we have to use to try and describe it, until in the end only silence will do. And Teresa begins this discussion by saying, very few will experience the things I am about to describe. I think this puts it in perspective for me. All I can do is to say what Teresa tells us and what that means, how that affects me in some way. I think she's getting to a point where she's moved beyond my poor efforts. And she's talking primarily in this section about the prayer of union. The prayer of union. You find that in other mystics as well, but I'll just read how she describes the prayer of union. Don't think that this union is some kind of dreamy state like the one I was talking about earlier. The reason I would even use the term dream is that the soul seems to fall asleep. But she is neither sleeping nor awake. It's the faculties that are asleep in this state, deeply asleep to things of the world and to the self. In fact, during the short time the prayer of union lasts, the soul transcends both sense and reason. She couldn't think a single thought, even if she wanted to. Any prescribed technique for suspending consciousness is rendered utterly unnecessary. And a bit later she goes on, in a state of union, the soul sees nothing and hears nothing and comprehends nothing. Union lasts such a short time, and it seems even shorter than it really is. God presses himself so fully against the inside of the soul that when she returns to herself, the soul has no doubt whatsoever that God was in her and she was in God. This truth remains with her forever. Even though years may go by without God granting this blessing again, the soul never forgets. She never doubts. God was in her and she was in God. this knowingness is all that matters. She talks about this state of union lasting for half an hour at the most in our time, but in God's time, that's an eternity. And she warns against thinking that this will lead to some kind of happiness ever after. Far from it, she says. If anyone reported to me that after arriving here, she sustained a state of rest and bliss from then on, I would say that she'd not actually reached this place. Maybe she got as far as the dwelling before this one and experienced some kind of spiritual consolation there, which was enhanced by her natural weakness. Maybe it was even the spirit of evil feeding false peace to the soul, so that it could shatter her later with an even more savage attack. The pitfalls even seem to increase as we move further along the spiritual path, deceiving ourselves perhaps that we've reached a level that we've not actually reached just because we feel some kind of peace, or as Teresa calls it, spiritual consolation. We imagine that we're further along the path than we really are. And that can even be a false peace to lull us into a sense of complacency so that we can be attacked even more. And Teresa tells us that apart from being at peace all the time, there's actually quite a lot of suffering, and that suffering is because of increased compassion, which comes after union. Increased and true love of neighbour. She says, there is a certain soul I know, and I think this must be her. There is a certain soul I know who suffers terribly whenever she sees that the beloved is being dishonoured. Her pain is so intense that she would rather die than endure it. Compared to the charity of Christ, the soul's charity is minuscule. And so if she experiences this torment as unbearable, what must our beloved Jesus Christ have felt? What kind of existence must he have suffered, since absolutely everything was clear to him and he was continuously witnessing terrible offences being committed against his Father? And she suggests even that this anguish was much greater than his passion on the cross, that the pain of his compassion for others, seeing them go wrong, was actually greater than his own suffering on the cross. And she even suggests that his crucifixion was a release from that kind of pain, in that, as she puts it, in the midst of his passion, he could already see an end to his trials. This glimmer of imminent emancipation, along with the joy he felt at knowing that his death would serve as a remedy for the rest of us, plus knowing that he was a living example of perfect love for his Father through suffering perfectly for him, combined to temper his agony. And what I think this signifies is that what's being crucified and what we need to crucify when we're being crucified with Christ is our ego self, our attachment to ourselves and to our body and our mind. These are the things that are crucified. And Teresa even hints at that. And she says, and so it is here. That's after speaking about the passion being an emancipation, a relief. She says, and so it is here. When those who have grown strong in love practice renunciation, they rarely feel pain. Renunciation. Growing strong in love comes first, through union, then followed by renunciation. This is a great mystery. And later on, Teresa gives advice about prayer. And this can perhaps be our main focus for this meditation. I'll just read what she says first of all. We must be diligent. We must continually ask God in prayer to take us by the hand. We must always bear in mind that if He lets go of us, we may plummet into the abyss. We must remember to question ourselves, because false confidence is folly. The important thing is to walk with care and mindfulness, witnessing our own progress in the cultivation of virtue. Are we strengthening or weakening in certain areas? Pay special attention to these issues. And she tells us 3 things to pay special attention to. The first of these is love for one another. And by this she means a love so intense, a compassion so intense that it's painful. A love so intense that we would give up our own food in order to give food to somebody else in a time of famine or shortage. Love for one another totally, renouncing any thought of ourselves. The second consideration is absence of desire to be thought of as someone special. Getting carried away with ourselves. I used to give support to people who'd been just newly appointed as consultants in the NHS, consultant doctors. Most of them took to it fine because of their training, but some of them had quite pathological reactions. For some of them, it was terribly stressful to be the kind of end of the line in decision making, and they might get depressed and anxious and perhaps drink too much. But for others, and these were the most difficult, they thought that because they'd been appointed as consultants, that meant that they were, in fact, pretty much infallible. They became arrogant. And because of that, pretty much impossible to help, really. They didn't want any support. They didn't think that people like them needed any support because they were so good. And they're the ones who are responsible for many of the things that go wrong. And it's easy for us to get carried away thinking that we're in some way spiritually advanced, or that we are so far on in the path that we can teach other people and forget that we're all learning from each other. So not thinking that we're somebody special is one of the criteria. And the third criterion is an interesting one, the impeccable performance of mundane tasks. It seems, I think, that what she's talking about here is what the Zen Buddhists would call mindfulness. Mindful eating, mindful walking, mindful cleaning your teeth, the impeccable performance of mundane tasks, focused entirely on those tasks. The people who help with the cleaning at the church that I go to regard that as a mindfulness task. They talk of mindful cleaning, making it a spiritual exercise. Impeccable performance of mundane tasks. And I invite you now to think of each one of these that Teresa actually puts as being issues that we should pay special attention to in our own assessing our own spiritual development. Take them one at a time, see how they relate to us. Just spend a few minutes on each one before going into silence. So the first one, love for one another. And the second one, absence of desire to be thought of as someone special. third one, the impeccable performance of mundane tasks. And now we can move into a short time of contemplative silence. Amen.